It started innocently enough. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to understand me in ways no one else did. When he slid into my life, it felt like a key finding its lock, effortless, natural, and meant to be. I didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. I was too busy basking in the warmth of his attention, the way he made me feel seen. At first, it was the little things that drew me in. The way he remembered the details. I thought no one noticed my favorite coffee order. The song I hummed when I was lost in thought. The way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous. He noticed it all, and it made me feel special, like I was the only person in the room whenever he was around. His laughter was infectious, and his smile had a way of lighting up even the darkest days. I found myself looking forward to every text, every call, every moment we spent together. But it wasn't just the attention that hooked me. It was the way he made me feel about myself. With him, I felt like the best version of me, confident, valued, and loved. He had a way of making me believe in us, in the idea that we were something rare and unshakable. I trusted him completely, and that trust became the foundation of everything we built. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. Love has a way of blinding you, of making you ignore the red flags waving right in front of your face. I didn't want to see the signs because I was too caught up in the fantasy of what we could be. I convinced myself that the little inconsistencies didn't matter, that the occasional distance in his eyes was just stress or fatigue. I told myself that every relationship has its ups and downs, and that we were strong enough to weather any storm. But the truth is, I was ignoring my instincts. There were moments when something felt off, like a faint buzzing in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite silence. Like the time he canceled our plans last minute, claiming he had to work late, but his voice sounded just a little too rehearsed. Or the way he'd sometimes disappear for hours, only to reappear with a vague excuse that didn't quite add up. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was being paranoid. I didn't want to believe that the person I loved could ever lie to me. And then there were the little things he said, the offhand comments that seemed harmless at the time but took on a different meaning later. Like when he joked about how easy it was to keep secrets in a relationship, or how he believed that some lies were necessary to keep the peace. I laughed it off, thinking it was just his sense of humor, but now I wonder if he was testing the waters, seeing how much I would let slide. The worst part is, I didn't see any of it coming. I was so wrapped up in the idea of us, in the future I thought we were building together, that I missed the warning signs. I didn't want to believe that the person who made me feel so loved could also be capable of hurting me so deeply. I trusted him completely, and that trust became my downfall. Little did I know, the foundation we built was made of sand, and the tide was coming in. The cracks were there all along, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to split wide open. But I was too busy looking at the stars to notice the ground crumbling beneath my feet. In the end, it wasn't one big moment that shattered everything. It was the accumulation of all those little things. The missed calls, the vague excuses, the distance that grew between us, even when we were in the same room. It was the way he started to pull away, leaving me grasping at straws, trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through my fingers. But even then I held on. I told myself that love was worth fighting for, that every relationship has its challenges. I convinced myself that if I just loved him enough, if I just tried harder, we could find our way back to each other. I didn't want to believe that the key that once fit so perfectly could ever turn against me. Looking back now, I see how foolish I was. Love shouldn't have to be that hard. It shouldn't leave you feeling like you're constantly chasing after someone who's already halfway out the door. But at the time, I couldn't see it. I was too caught up in the idea of us, in the fantasy of what we could be, to see the reality of what we were becoming. And so I stayed. I stayed even when my instincts told me to run. I stayed even when the cracks began to show. I stayed because I believed in him, in us, in the love that once felt so real. But the truth is, I was holding on to something that was already broken, something that could never be put back together the way it was before. Little did I know, the key that once fit so perfectly was about to turn, and the lock I thought was unbreakable was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. The first time I felt something was off, I brushed it aside. He was working late more often, his texts became shorter, and there was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I told myself it was stress, that everyone goes through rough patches. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered that something wasn't right. It started with the little things, the kind of details that seem insignificant on their own but add up over time, like the way he'd suddenly become protective of his phone, keeping it face down on the table or slipping it into his pocket the moment I walked into the room. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just being cautious, or maybe he was trying to be more present when we were together. But then I noticed how he'd quickly close out of apps when I came near, or how he'd angle the screen away from me when he was texting. It was subtle, but it was there, and it made me uneasy. Then there were the late nights. He'd always been a hard worker, but suddenly, he was staying at the office later than ever before. At first, I believed him when he said he was swamped with projects, that he was just trying to get ahead. But then the excuses started to pile up. A last-minute meeting, a client dinner, a networking event. Each one sounded plausible on its own, but together, they felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. I tried to push the doubts out of my mind. I didn't want to be that person, the one who overanalyzed every little thing, who jumped to conclusions without proof. But the more I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, the louder it became. It was like a splinter I couldn't quite remove, a constant, low-level ache that wouldn't go away. And then came the night I found the receipt. It was tucked in the pocket of his jacket, a crumpled piece of paper from a restaurant I'd never been to. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe he'd gone out with a coworker or an old friend. But then I noticed the date. It was from a night he'd told me he was working late. My heart sank as I stared at the numbers on the receipt. The total for 2 meals, staring back at me like an accusation. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a business dinner. Maybe he'd forgotten to mention it. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew like a weed, choking out the trust I once had. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the man I loved was keeping secrets from me. The days that followed were a blur of second-guessing and overthinking. I found myself replaying every conversation, every interaction, searching for clues I might have missed. I started noticing things I hadn't before, the way he'd sometimes zone out when we were talking, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. The way he'd deflect when I asked him about his day, giving vague answers that left me feeling more confused than before. The way he'd sometimes look at me with a strange expression, like he was trying to figure out how much I knew. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers. But I was afraid of what I might find out. What if I was wrong? What if I was just being paranoid, and he really was just stressed or overwhelmed? I didn't want to risk pushing him away, not when I still loved him so much. So I kept quiet, burying my doubts and fears beneath a smile, pretending everything was fine even when it felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. But the more I tried to ignore the signs, the harder they became to ignore. There were nights when he'd come home late, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. There were mornings when he'd leave early, claiming he had to get to the office, but I'd notice how carefully he dressed, like he was trying to impress someone. And then there were the times when he'd disappear for hours, his phone going straight to voicemail when I tried to call. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared of what I might find out. Scared of what it would mean for us. Scared of losing the person I thought I knew. I didn't want to believe that the man I loved could ever lie to me, could ever betray me in such a profound way. But the cracks were there, and they were getting harder to ignore. And then there were the dreams. I started having these vivid, unsettling dreams where I'd catch him in a lie, only to wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. In the dreams, he'd always have this look on his face, a mix of guilt and defiance, like he knew he'd been caught but didn't care. I'd wake up feeling sick to my stomach, the line between dream and reality blurring until I wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. I tried to push the dreams out of my mind, to convince myself they were just a product of my anxiety, but they lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake, and as the days turned into weeks, the doubts grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that the person I loved, the person I trusted with my heart, could ever do something to hurt me. But the evidence was there, staring me in the face, and I couldn't pretend anymore. The cracks were growing wider, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The receipt was just the beginning, the first thread in a web of lies that would soon unravel everything I thought I knew. But at the time, I was still holding on, still hoping that I was wrong, that there was some explanation that would make it all make sense. I didn't want to face the truth. Not yet. But the truth has a way of finding you, no matter how hard you try to hide from it. And soon I would have no choice but to confront it head on. The truth hit me like a freight train. I wasn't even looking for it, but there it was. Undeniable proof of his betrayal. A text message popped up on his phone while he was in the shower, and I couldn't look away. The words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. He had been lying to me, cheating on me, and the person I thought I knew was a stranger. I remember standing there, holding his phone in my hands, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize, followed by a message that left no room for doubt. It was intimate, familiar, the kind of message you only send to someone you're close to. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the conversation, each word a punch to the gut. There were plans to meet, inside jokes and promises of more to come. It was like reading a script for a life I didn't know existed, a life he had been living right under my nose. I felt numb at first, like my body was trying to protect me from the pain. But then it all came crashing down. Anger, sadness, humiliation. How could he do this to me? How could I have been so blind? The lock that once felt so secure was shattered, and I was left picking up the pieces. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the screen as if hoping the words would somehow change, as if this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But the truth was staring me in the face, and there was no escaping it. When he finally came out of the shower, I was still standing there, his phone clutched in my hand. He took one look at me and knew. I could see it in his eyes, the guilt, the fear, the realization that the game was up. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was deafening, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid, and then I handed him the phone. I didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't say a word. I just handed it to him, and waited. He looked at the screen, his face pale, and then back at me. I could see him scrambling for an explanation, for some way to spin this, to make it seem like it wasn't what it looked like. But there was nothing he could say, no excuse that could undo what he had done. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet, hesitant, like he was afraid of what I might do. He tried to explain, to justify, to make it sound like it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But every word out of his mouth felt like a betrayal all over again. He talked about how it didn't mean anything, how it was just a mistake, how he never meant to hurt me. But the truth was, he had hurt me. He had lied to me, betrayed me, and broken the trust I had placed in him. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was standing outside of myself, watching this scene play out like it was happening to someone else. Part of me wanted to scream, to lash out, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain I was feeling. But another part of me just wanted to curl up and disappear, to wake up and find out this was all just a bad dream. In the end, I didn't say much. I couldn't. The words wouldn't come, stuck in my throat like a lump I couldn't swallow. I just stood there, staring at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the man I thought I knew. How could someone who claimed to love me do something like this? How could he look me in the eye every day and lie to me so effortlessly? He kept talking, his voice growing more desperate, more pleading. He said he was sorry, that he would do anything to fix this, that he loved me and didn't want to lose me. But the words felt hollow, empty, like they were coming from a script he had rehearsed in his head. I wanted to believe him, to believe that this was just a mistake, that we could move past it. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could ever trust him again. Eventually, I walked away. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with him, to hear him try to explain away what he had done. I needed space, time to think, to process what had just happened. I went to the bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it as the tears finally came. I cried for what felt like hours, my body shaking with sobs as the weight of everything came crashing down. I cried for the love I thought we had, for the future I thought we were building, for the person I thought he was. I cried for myself, for the way I had let myself be fooled, for the way I had ignored the signs until it was too late. And then, when the tears finally stopped, I felt something else. Anger. Not just at him, but at myself. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let myself fall so completely for someone who could do something like this? I felt like a fool, like I had given my heart to someone who didn't deserve it. But amidst the anger and the pain, there was also a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was seeing things clearly, like the fog had lifted and I could finally see the truth. He wasn't the person I thought he was. The man I loved, the man I had built my life around, didn't exist. He was a figment of my imagination, a fantasy I had created to fill the void. And now, that fantasy was gone, shattered into a million pieces. I didn't know what came next, how I would pick up the pieces and move on. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't go back to the way things were. The lock had been broken, and there was no fixing it. The days that followed were a blur. I moved through them like a ghost, going through the motions but feeling nothing. He tried to talk to me, to apologize, to explain, but I couldn't bring myself to listen. Every word out of his mouth felt like a betrayal, a reminder of everything he had done. I didn't know what to do, how to move forward. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. The truth had been revealed, and now it was up to me to decide what came next. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. The lock had been broken, but I was still standing, and that had to count for something. The days that followed were a blur. I cried more than I thought possible, replaying every moment in my head, searching for clues I might have missed. I felt like a fool, like I had given my heart to someone who didn't deserve it. But amidst the pain, something unexpected happened. I started to find my strength. At first, the pain was all-consuming. It felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the betrayal that had shattered my world. I replayed every conversation, every moment we had shared, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. I blamed myself, wondering if I had missed something, if I had done something to push him away. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. The pain was still there, but it wasn't as sharp, as all-encompassing. I started to see things more clearly, to realize that his betrayal wasn't about me, it was about him. I wasn't the problem, he was. And while that didn't erase the hurt, it gave me a sense of clarity, a sense of power that I hadn't felt in a long time. I began to rebuild myself, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I felt like I was taking one step forward and 2 steps back. But I kept going, determined not to let his actions define me. I started small, focusing on the things that made me feel like myself again. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, throwing myself into their company and letting their laughter and support remind me that I wasn't alone. I also threw myself into my work, using it as a distraction and a way to prove to myself that I was still capable, still strong. I took on projects I had been putting off, challenging myself to push past the pain and focus on something productive. It wasn't a cure, but it helped. It gave me a sense of purpose, a reminder that there was more to life than the heartbreak I was feeling. And then there were the nights, the long, lonely nights when the silence felt suffocating and the memories came flooding back. Those were the hardest moments, the ones where I felt the most vulnerable, the most broken. But even in those moments, I found ways to cope. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts and feelings onto paper as a way to process everything that had happened. It was cathartic, a way to release the emotions that had been bottled up inside me. I also started taking care of myself in ways I hadn't before. I began exercising, not just as a way to stay busy, but as a way to reconnect with my body, to remind myself that I was still alive, still capable of feeling strong and powerful. I started eating better, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to nourish myself, to treat my body with the kindness and respect it deserved. And then there were the small victories, the moments when I realized I had gone an entire hour without thinking about him, or when I caught myself smiling at something completely unrelated to the pain I had been carrying. Those moments were fleeting at first, but they grew more frequent as time went on. They were reminders that life was still happening, that there was still joy to be found, even in the midst of the pain. But perhaps the most important thing I did during that time was to forgive myself. I had spent so much time blaming myself, wondering what I could have done differently, what I could have done to prevent this from happening. But I realized that I wasn't to blame. I had loved him with everything I had, and that wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. The fact that he had betrayed that love said more about him than it did about me. Forgiving myself wasn't easy. It required me to let go of the guilt, the shame, the self-doubt that had been weighing me down. But once I did, I felt a sense of freedom, a sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. I realized that I didn't have to carry the weight of his mistakes, that I could set it down and walk away. And so I did. I started to rebuild my life, not as the person I had been before, but as someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient. I began to see the betrayal not as the end of my story, but as a turning point, a chance to start over and create something new. It wasn't a linear process. There were days when the pain felt fresh, when the memories came rushing back and threatened to pull me under. But even on those days, I reminded myself of how far I had come, of the strength I had found within myself. I reminded myself that I was more than the sum of my pain, that I was capable of healing, of growing, of moving forward. And as I did, I began to see the world in a new light. I started to notice the small, beautiful moments that I had been too numb to see before, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of laughter echoing down the street, the feeling of warmth as I wrapped myself in a blanket on a cold night. Those moments reminded me that life was still beautiful, still worth living, even after everything that had happened. I also began to see myself in a new light. I realized that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for, that I had survived something that could have broken me. I realized that I was capable of love, of trust, of vulnerability, even after being hurt so deeply. And I realized that I deserved better, better than the lies, the betrayal. The journey wasn't over. I knew there would still be challenges, still be moments when the pain felt overwhelming. But I also knew that I had the strength to face them, to keep moving forward, to keep rebuilding my life one piece at a time. And so, I did. I took each day as it came, focusing on the present instead of dwelling on the past. I surrounded myself with people who loved and supported me, who reminded me of my worth. I pursued the things that brought me joy, that made me feel alive. And slowly, but surely, I began to heal. The betrayal had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. It had taught me lessons I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Lessons about love, about trust, about the importance of valuing myself. And while I would never be grateful for the pain, I was grateful for the strength it had given me, for the person it had forced me to become. I was no longer the same person I had been before. I was stronger, wiser, and more resilient, and I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to survive, to thrive, and to create a life that was truly my own. Forgiveness didn't come easily. For a long time, I thought forgiving him would mean excusing what he did, but I've come to see it differently. Forgiveness isn't about him, it's about me. It's about letting go of the anger and the pain so I can move forward. At first, the idea of forgiveness felt impossible. How could I forgive someone who had hurt me so deeply? How could I let go of the anger that had been my constant companion for so long? The thought of forgiving him felt like a betrayal of myself, like I was letting him off the hook for what he had done. But as time went on, I began to realize that holding on to that anger was only hurting me. It was like carrying around a heavy weight, one that dragged me down and kept me stuck in the past. I started to see forgiveness not as something I was giving to him, but as something I was giving to myself. It was a way to release the pain, to let go of the bitterness that had been poisoning my heart. I realized that forgiving him didn't mean I had to forget what he had done, or that I had to let him back into my life. It simply meant that I was choosing to stop letting his actions control me, to stop letting the past dictate my future. The process of forgiveness was slow and uneven. There were days when I felt like I had made progress, when I could think about what had happened without feeling that familiar surge of anger and hurt. But there were also days when the pain felt fresh, when the memories came rushing back and I found myself right back where I started. On those days, I had to remind myself that forgiveness wasn't a one-time event, but a journey, one that would take time and patience and effort. I also had to confront the fear that forgiving him would make me vulnerable, that it would open the door for him to hurt me again. But I realized that forgiveness didn't mean I had to trust him again, or that I had to let him back into my life. It simply meant that I was choosing to let go of the anger and the pain, to stop letting his actions have power over me. As I began to let go of the anger, I noticed a shift in myself. I felt lighter, freer, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I started to see the world in a new light, to notice the small, beautiful moments that I had been too consumed by pain to see before. I found joy in the simple things: a warm cup of coffee in the morning, a walk in the park on a sunny day, the sound of laughter shared with friends. Those moments reminded me that life was still beautiful, still worth living, even after everything that had happened. I also began to see myself in a new light. I realized that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for, that I had survived something that could have broken me. I realized that I was capable of love, of trust, of vulnerability, even after being hurt so deeply. And I realized that I deserved better, better than the lies, the betrayal, the pain. Forgiving him didn't mean I had to forget what he had done, or that I had to pretend it didn't hurt. It simply meant that I was choosing to stop letting his actions define me, to stop letting the past dictate my future. I was choosing to take back control of my life, to create a future that was mine and mine alone. And as I did, I began to see the possibilities that lay ahead. I started to dream again, to imagine a life filled with love and joy and fulfillment. I realized that the betrayal had been a turning point, a chance to start over and create something new. It had taught me lessons I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Lessons about love, about trust, about the importance of valuing myself. I also began to see the ways in which I had grown. I was no longer the same person I had been before. I was stronger, wiser, and more resilient. I had learned to stand up for myself, to set boundaries, to value my own worth. I had learned that I didn't need someone else to complete me, that I was enough just as I was. The journey wasn't over. I knew there would still be challenges, still be moments when the pain felt overwhelming. But I also knew that I had the strength to face them, to keep moving forward, to keep building a life that was truly my own. And so I did. I took each day as it came, focusing on the present instead of dwelling on the past. I surrounded myself with people who loved and supported me, who reminded me of my worth. I pursued the things that brought me joy, that made me feel alive. And slowly, but surely, I began to heal. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about him, it was about me. It was about letting go of the anger and the pain so I could move forward, so I could create a life that was filled with love and joy and fulfillment. It was about choosing to stop letting his actions control me, to stop letting the past dictate my future. And as I did, I began to see the world in a new light. I started to notice the small, beautiful moments that I had been too numb to see before, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of laughter echoing down the street, the feeling of warmth as I wrapped myself in a blanket on a cold night. Those moments reminded me that life was still beautiful, still worth living, even after everything that had happened. I also began to see myself in a new light. I realized that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for, that I had survived something that could have broken me. I realized that I was capable of love, of trust, of vulnerability, even after being hurt so deeply. And I realized that I deserved better than the lies, the betrayal, the pain. The betrayal had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. It had taught me lessons I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Lessons about love, about trust, about the importance of valuing myself. And while I would never be grateful for the pain, I was grateful for the strength it had given me, for the person it had forced me to become. I was no longer the same person I had been before. I was stronger, wiser, and more resilient. And I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to survive, to thrive, and to create a life that was truly my own.